Hello, everyone. Welcome to this final session of Istanbul Unbound, Environmental Approaches to the City conference. We have now Cemal Kafadar to give his closing remarks for this conference. We are so happy that he accepted our invitation. And of course, thank you all. Thanks to everyone for being with us, for staying with us for these 4 days. I think it's been a very successful and very productive conference. There were a lot of very brilliant discussions, brilliant presentations. So thank you all so much. And thanks, of course, to the audience for listening and joining the conversation. Our closing remarks speaker, Cemal Kafadar, is the Vehbi Professor of Turkish Studies at Harvard University's Department of History. He is interested in the social and cultural history of the Middle East and southeastern Europe in the late medieval and early modern era. His books include Kendine Ait Bir Roma, Diyar-ı Rum'da Ku, Kimlik Üzerine, İmiş, Burada, İken, Dört Osmanlı, Yeniçeri, ccar, Derviş ve Hatun, Between Two Worlds, The Construction of the Ottoman State. His most recent publication is a co-edited multi-volume Treasures of Knowledge, an inventory of the Ottoman Palace Library, which includes his essay on Bayezid II, Amasya, and the Palace Library. Another volume he's co-editing on Istanbul's nature is forthcoming, hopefully this year, I don't know. And he worked closely on the conception and production of 2 historical documentaries, Inspirations on Sheikh Bedreddin and Invisible to the Eye on the mid-17th century account of Istanbul by Eremya Çelebi Kömu. And apart from all of this very important work, Cemal Kafadar has also been very inspirational for allying his scholarship with urban and environmental activism, and through that not only motivating activists but also researchers to be interested in the non-human actors and non-conventional spaces in Istanbul. So we are so grateful that he is closing this conference, and with that I'm leaving the floor to him. Thank you so much, Cemal Bey.
Thank you so much, Mehmet. And all organizers, I would like to begin by thanking you for honoring me with this invitation to give the closing remarks, and to also for having organized this fabulous and fabulously important meeting, series of sessions, big conference. I know how much that takes from the organizers, and I do appreciate very much the thinking, the logistical work, everything that went into it. And I would like to thank Mehmet Kentel, Özlem Altınkaya, people I know well, but all others who have worked on this 3.5 days event that we're now closing. This conference is organized at the moment. Let me see what I can do about my position here without making a mess. This conference is organized at a moment when the city, Poli, Istanbul, is facing unprecedented challenges to its integrity and dignity, to its unique geography that has proven hospitable and responsive for millennia in multiple ways to the cultivation of civilized modes of living in relative harmony with it. It may be considered a curse, or divine justice perhaps, that a city which has for centuries represented to millions of people the universal experience of urbanity and been invoked as the ideal site of world power by numerous fanciful minds, now embodies the global plague of mega projects on a mythical scale. I want to tell you a story today, or rather give you the background to and a brief synopsis of the story of an ill-begotten channel to link the 2 seas, the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, in competition with the Bosphorus. Such a legend was evidently once woven into pre-modern urban legends and needs to be remembered. Told in Eremya Çelebi's inimitable style, imbued with humor and a sense of wonder, even in an account of a nightmare, it is a tale of hubris, defiance of divine decree and of the natural order of things, and of ultimate failure. Yanko bin Madyan, my main character today, one of the two evil rulers of all time who brought defilement to the world, equaled only by Nebuchadnezzar, wanted to build the channel even while he knew that God had decreed that Alexander of two horns, Iskender Zülkarneyn, was destined to build it. Alexander and Süleyman, that is King and Prophet Süleyman, Hazreti Süleyman, Solomon, are the two characters identified as two world rulers of justice and goodness. And they are juxtaposed in this huge body of lore, of which Evliya is only representative of a certain part. In this huge body of lore, Süleyman and Alexander are juxtaposed to two evil characters of all time, that is Nebuchadnezzar and Yanko bin Madyan. Sometimes, or often, actually, you do have Nemrut instead of Yanko, but Yanko is a specifically Ottoman innovation and invention to develop a particular discourse on Istanbul, as already identified and brilliantly elucidated by Stefanos Gerasimos, to whom I am also presenting this as a tribute to his memory. Now, what takes place during a good, successful conference is, in addition to the sharing of research and ideas, entrainment, namely getting in sync, as Ursula Le Guin explains in entrainment, on speaking and finding a shared rhythm. She writes, first she gives the example of amoebas. Some of you may remember this brilliant passage. She gives the example of amoebas exchanging genetic information by literally giving each other inner bits of their bodies, and then frames this or presents this as a parallel, not exactly the same thing, but a parallel to human conversation, how people unite themselves and give each other parts of themselves, inner parts, mental, not bodily parts, when they talk and listen. And she then, Ursula Le Guin, considers the singular and immutable power of spoken conversation in fostering a profound mutuality by syncing our essential vibrations. By reading this, I would like to express my gratitude to all the participants, the presenters above all, but to all the participants who have given me this feeling of entrainment and sharing something in sync, far more than just research and ideas on surface, or even beyond it, but verbally, something far more than that. For the sake of sustaining symmetry with the earlier part of the conference, where we started and where we are ending now, let me give you, read you a brief passage from Anat Singh, who started, of course, with her opening keynote speech on Thursday evening. In one of her interviews, she says, "Often we take it for granted that things are the way they are because that is the way they have always been. Anthropology, science fiction, and good historical scholarship too." And she identified good historical scholarship. I'm fine with that. Anthropology, science fiction, and good historical scholarship too aim to collapse this contention by reminding us that what appears fixed and unequivocal now may actually have only come about quite recently. Brilliant, true, and in the spirit of a conversation which often invites some symmetry of perspectives, I would say right and vice versa. Namely, that something looks like it is a matter of conjuncture, of the here and now, is perhaps also deeply structural. To pursue this perspective, this angle, we need to plunge into what I will characterize this Yanko bin Madyan tale as, namely science fiction in deep time, or mythology. We had too much reality, perhaps, for the last 3.5 days, and let me conclude with some mythology, which says, in short, that there were mega projects in Istanbul's past, as in the past of many cities, mega cities of a similar sort. And they were not good for the city or for its denizens, human and non-human. If we wish to learn from some of the ways in which people of the pre-industrial era interacted with the world, we may wish to get closer to some of the ways in which they spoke about the world, which included a good deal of stuff that the scientific world has learned to call myth. And fine, sure, they are myths. But what do they tell us? And what did they tell them? Just as we do not wish anymore to recognize man's, and this is capital M, man, just as we do not wish anymore to recognize man's power over the world, but rather think of all animals, all beings, all things as sharing it, we need to find ways of learning from other ways of learning. Not only the ways of learning of other species, which we certainly have started, but barely started to do, but also from the ways of learning of earlier humans, whom the modern era has tended to often consider medieval, credulous, and unscientific, which is true at some level, but obviously given short shrift to the kind of wisdom and learning that could be embedded and embodied and experienced and enacted in their worlds. Yes, there is the danger of romanticizing here, but there is also the danger of selling ourselves short of their wisdom and learning. First of all, there is regional knowledge, the notion as developed by Vidal de la Blache, embedded in the lore and technique of things like building caramel boats, the type of boats that were specifically designed or at least specifically useful in the Marmara region. Or this regional knowledge embodied in knowledge such as cutting trees on the 13th of November so that they do not rot, namely the lumber doesn't. This is a notion that appears in the calendar of Sheikh Ebul Vefa from the second half of the 15th century, but also in the tale, I will get to that tale, about Sheddad's crazy project, the craziest of them all maybe, to construct a paradise on earth. Now, that I mentioned Gerasimos, who demonstrated the relevance of the legends, for very good reason, he focused on the political framework, the pro- and anti-imperial ideologies of those myths, and he elucidated them with such originality and brilliance that we remain indebted to him. And during the conference, too, there were several references, of course, to his body of work, so inspirational. And his work remains a challenge for the die-hard conquest addicts to this day, since they cannot accept the fact that the conquest of Constantinople, Istanbul, was not an unadulterated blessing for the contemporary subjects of the Ottoman State, Muslim or non-Muslim. But I want to take a step beyond that political discussion of pro- and anti-imperial ideologies embodied in the tale, and turn to the environmental dimension of the legends that is still not taken into account, fully at least not taken into account, let alone being taken seriously. For one thing, because environmental studies are relatively young, and for another thing, it's ergonomically too awkward for me to look at two screens. I apologize, I haven't mastered this yet. I would rather look at you in person, if not that, at least directly into the camera, but I don't have that pleasure. The environmental dimension of legends is still not fully appreciated or taken into account. For one thing, because environmental studies themselves are relatively young, as I said, but for another, Eremya Çelebi is still read in fragmentary fashion. Of course, it's a huge, sprawling text. One cannot read everything, and even if one does, cannot remember every bit from volume 9 to a cross-reference to a volume 2, in volume 2, say. But ultimately, Eremya Çelebi's text, and remember, he considered it unfinished, even at that late stage. It's like the late work by, I don't know if you read the essay, Late Work by Edward Said, how for some great artists, there is an unfinished, chaotic late work there that just bugs them all their lives and does get all their brilliance into it, but remains unfinished. That is how I see Eremya's Book of Travels. And given the way we have it, unfortunately, we miss a good deal of it if we do not read transversally from one mention of Yanko to yet another mention of Yanko, and sometimes passages where Yanko is not at all mentioned, but implicitly he is he's one of the characters embedded in that story. In any case, you will see why I've said this and why I feel that the environmental dimensional legends were not given full credit. Let me move to the narrative or set of narratives, all of which lead to the discovery of the current site of Istanbul as a wonderful event. Can I have the slides, Mehmet, please?
Coming right away.
Good, thank you.
Can you see it? Is it good?
I see it in the little box.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Okay, this is by way of a missing title, but you'll see what I mean when we get to it at the end. Istanbul Found and Lost. Not again is my battle cry. Next. Okay, let us move to the narrative or set of narratives, all of which lead to the discovery of the current site of Istanbul is a wonderful event, as I said. Looking at this map, which distorts the perspective, of course, but gives us a wonderful idea of the kind of place that the Marmara Sea as a region constituted. We're looking at the longitudinal, let's say, south-north perspective from the Channel of Dardanelles all the way to Constantinople with some important landmarks around the sea and lands. The location of Istanbul, ultimately, when it was discovered and built upon, the location of Istanbul makes such good sense, but it is only after the fact, after it was found. And all of the legends tell us that the city was not so easy to find. The location, in other words, was not so easy to find. A comprehensive look at the tales of alternatives to our Istanbul, alternatives to our current Istanbul, a comprehensive look at all those tales proves that Özlem Altınkaya, Dr. Altınkaya, is right. The site of Istanbul can be fully understood, appreciated, and studied only through a regional perspective. This is very important in our day, especially when we are hoping to think in more sophisticated ways about the environmental questions regarding the past, present, and future of our dear city. For the Marmara Basin, especially, Özlem Altınkaya made the point of Istanbul, studying Istanbul in this regional perspective and demonstrated it actually in her brilliant dissertation. But let me also mention for Ottomanists the unfortunately neglected discussion of circa 1950 when Mustafa Akdağ presented a thesis that the rise of the Ottoman state, the emergence of a new polity, which eventually became the Ottoman state, was possible because of a set of realities around the Marmara Basin as a region. The theory was not fully developed and had many, many flaws, admittedly, which Inalcik pointed out in a devastating critical review. This exchange took place in Belleten, in a series of issues. And Akdağ's idea of the Marmara Basin has really been sidelined ever since. And to those who are interested in late medieval and especially Ottoman history, I would recommend revisiting that debate from circa 1950 in thinking about Istanbul and Bursa and the Marmara Basin and its historical role. Now, next, please. Oops, I did something wrong. Okay, that's good. Now, on the map, I have placed, thanks to assistant who worked with me, Kaan Hotan. Thank you very much, Kaan. I placed on this map the places that would have been Istanbul, that were alternatives to Istanbul, as I mentioned, until this very site became what it is, the flourishing city of Istanbul. Okay. Now, there are at least two of those sites that you're looking at are known as Eski Istanbul, which I translate as would be Istanbul, or could have been Istanbul, or Istanbul wannabes. The one that is better known is Alexandria Troas, where Constantine allegedly stopped while looking for a new capital to the east of Rome and considered it as the site of Troy, though it's very close. We don't need to deal with the archaeological precision of the late antique era, but he eventually decided that, of course, Istanbul would be the better choice. So that place for centuries has been known as Eski Istanbul or Eski Istanbulluk. Katip Çelebi, for instance, mentions that. Veliki Preslav is less known to Ottomanists, but should be. It was known as Eski Istanbulcuk until it was renamed as Veliki Preslav after the independence of Bulgaria in 1878. It's now mostly a village and a ruined site with some serious archaeology happening near Shumen. And it was founded by the Proto-Bulgarians in the 8th century and served as the capital of Bulgaria under Simeon the Great in the 10th century. So that was established long after the city of Constantinople or Constantine's city was already flourishing. Still, the one in Bulgaria reflected not only competitive claims over the Byzantine capital that were all around, but also a key location on the Milk Road, a much neglected dimension of Istanbul's geography, occluded by the global fantasy of a Silk Road plied by caravans and galleons, which is considered far more appropriate to advertise the romance of global trade in the age of global capital. I'm not going to be able to develop this dimension, but the agrarian and pastoral links of Istanbul, especially to the Thracian, all the way into actually northern Bulgarian, Macedonian countrysides, is a matter of great further research topic. Now, Nicomedia, I won't dwell on much, was also considered very seriously as a site for the Eastern Roman Empire, for the Roman Empire as it moved to the east before it was called the Eastern Roman Empire. An earthquake seems to have mattered a lot in that regard, but we also, according to Gerasimos, we likely owe the name of Yanko bin Madian to a corruption, distortion of the name of the city, Nicomedia. This is not conclusive, it doesn't present it as conclusive, but this is still where we are in terms of identifying who this character, Yanko bin Madian, may have been, even in all the collections of myths, and how his name and identification may have come about. That still is a mystery. I'll get to that in a minute. And then there is Kyzikos, where I will, and I want to dwell on that a little bit more. Next slide, please. Okay, next. Right, Alexandria transcript. And next, okay, good. This is where Kyzikos is, and in the smaller rectangular screen, you do see it within the framework of the Marmara Sea. Now, of the larger corpus of tales related to our topic, which is really truly immense, of that larger corpus, I will focus only on the Kyzikos Constantinople variant, which is the wildest in terms of myth-historical imagination. It is a huge and unwieldy corpus, which I am sure would have been far more so if we could include the oral renditions. There are many variants, even in the written form, and inconsistencies among them, and there are many loose ends. Some of this is rather like those issues of continuity and accuracy that nerdy fans keep finding in historic movies, even in the best ones. So don't please underestimate the tales if they do have some loose ends and some inconsistencies. Anyway, now the Ottoman lore about ancient foundations of Istanbul is based on old stuff, for sure. That includes Kyzikos, Alexandria, Troas, and all that. Even the specific lore about Yanko, of which we know nothing before Turkish texts from the mid-15th century onwards, may have had a life before the texts. The textualization happened in the mid-15th century and morphed into a myth-historical corpus of its own, spawning variants and elaborations and echoes for at least 2 centuries until the late 17th century. Some of these later texts, such as that of Eremya Çelebi, are extremely significant in terms of the overall meaning attached, once by folks relating these tales, listening to them, reading them, and speaking about them. Obviously, it was extremely significant in terms of the overall meaning attached to Yanko's adventures by all those people in the early modern era. It is impossible to work out the exact trajectory of the textual reworkings, when and who and what kind of interaction took place between oral and written renditions, for instance. So I ask for your permission to take some shortcuts and do some heavy ironing of tough textual creases. Here is one way to put together the narrative with the shape it took after the emergence or the inclusion of a character called Yanko bin Madian, a likely Ottoman Turkish innovation in that older body of tales around the middle of the 15th century. Okay. Kyzikos, let's take a close look at the site, and let me point out, this is for those, Bandırma and Erdek, I should also point out, for those who know the current geography, you know the place in southern Marmara. And the rather narrow strip of land that connects Kapıdağ Yarımadası, the peninsula, to the Anatolian landmass, is, according to some ancient geographers like Plinius, a feature that emerged only in the 1st century of the Common Era. So some of these legends about grand geographic transformations are based on events that are well within human memory. Whatever shape they took as they turned into legends is another matter. So Cyzicus has that near island quality and was perhaps an island at a certain point 2,000 years ago or more. The historic site, next slide please, as excavated by archaeologists is well worth a visit, but it has been much reduced after the, next, let's move on from this. Next. Can you move? Okay. The historic site is well worth a visit, but it has been much reduced after a series of earthquakes beginning in the 5th century. Thereafter, the despoliation of its famous columns also started. You can go to the earlier slide, please. We moved a bit. Okay. So we don't have any of the famous ancient columns standing there because they have been despoliated, taken away by Byzantine and Ottoman builders and patrons of buildings mostly, to include in some of the famous buildings that we now know to be around in Istanbul. This is the sort of thing that you see when you go around now, still impressive in terms of a good many marble pieces, worked marble pieces. We can go through the next few slides, which people would see if they went to the museum in the area or the site itself in Cyzicus. Next. Next. Next. Next. That's more impressive. The coins of Cyzicus were, at some point, the gold coins were among the top standard coins of their time and enjoyed wide circulation. Next, the coins, next. Yes, back to myths. That's what I'm here about. Here for, rather. Okay. After the earthquakes beginning in the 5th century, the despoliation of its famous columns, the famous columns of Cyzicus started, first in Byzantine and then in Ottoman hands, for various construction projects in Istanbul. Its most glorious building is known as the colossal Temple of Hadrian, which was compared by some late antique writers to the 7 wonders of the world. Now, colossal constructions with columns in the late antique, medieval, and early modern era, colossal constructions with columns were often associated with Süleyman. This is a depiction of Hazreti Süleyman, Solomon, seated at the very top on his throne. Such colossal constructions were associated with Süleyman, who was believed to be the master of all earthly animals, including humans, of course, but also all birds and jinns, whom he could command to join his armies or labor forces for warfare or construction requiring huge logistical feats. This is from a book of Süleyman, not Süleyman the Ottoman Sultan, but Süleyman the Prophet. This is from a book of Süleyman in the Ottoman Palace from circa 1500, now at the Chester Beatty collection. And next is his romantic interest, Belkıs, seated on her throne. And next, you see them together as the frontispiece of this manuscript, the Book of Solomon, the Book of Süleyman, Süleymanname. And in very much the logic of graphic novels or bande dessinée, you see bands of various characters in their lives, including jinns and thieves and fairies and birds and all kinds of, and angels, all kinds of other beings that are part of this immense corpus of stories regarding Süleyman and Belkıs. Now, Süleyman built the city of Cyzicus with Belkıs. In fact, there is still the village of Belkıspınar, the spring of Belkıs, right next to the site, the archaeological site of Cyzicus. The two of them built the city of Cyzicus, according to the legends, made it into what it became, and only late in his life, Süleyman discovered, by chance, the current site of Istanbul. But as a prophet, he knew well that his demise was approaching, his death was approaching, so he decided not to build the city of Constantinople, returned to his other places, like Jerusalem, of course, among them, but also Cyzicus, and died soon thereafter. Now, eventually, this is one of the stories in which the finding of Istanbul, after other attempts at finding a place that could serve as a capital city of the Marmara region, one of the stories in which looking for and finding the right place for a site like that unfolded. Süleyman, as I said, discovered the site too late and didn't do anything with it. Eventually, Yanko bin Madyan has the good fortune of inheriting the place, and the city has the misfortune of falling into his hands, as we shall see. In this deep tradition of mythical knowledge production, the city has forever been tossed between fortune and misfortune, between being blessed and being cursed. Is it a matter of fate? Not exactly. Human beings do it in all these stories, of course, in terms of their entrainment, as it were, with providential design. In other words, there is providential design, but human beings run with it or against it. They are in sync with it or they're not, facing appropriate consequences. The divine order here represents the natural and just order, as in the case of Süleyman. Yanko, on the other hand, is one of several emperors who turned to construction projects as their ultimate statement to assert power. Power over human beings, power over all beings, power over nature and the world, power over other life forms, power over our reality. Now, after Süleyman passed away, his rule of justice disintegrated and tyrants popped up all over the world. Among them, two brothers, Şedid and Şeddad, stand out. Now, the other day I was telling this story to Cem Dinlenmiş, with whom we are working on a graphic novel on Yanko bin Madyan. Today I'm not going to be able to give you any of the great juicy details, I'm afraid. But we went over the story of Şedid and Şeddad, and Cem, I hope he's listening, brilliantly immediately pointed out, oh, this is just like Dumb and Dumber. Two brothers named Şedid and Şeddad really translates like the violent and the more violent. Şedid, as in shiddet, right? And Arabic works like English in this respect. So you can think of the logic of Dumb and Dumber. Would make a great movie. Anyway, Şeddad bin Ad claims to have divine power, uluhiyet. Whoa. And people point out to him that there is a God in heaven. And he says, yeah, he's the God of the skies. I'm the God of the earth. They say, but he has heaven. He has paradise. His believers will go to paradise. So Şeddad decides to build paradise. Can we move to the next slide? Okay. We don't have a depiction of the paradise, but here Şeddad is being slain by the angel of death as he deserved ultimately. Great story. Anyway, so Şeddad is people point out to Şeddad that God is able to offer his believers paradise. Şeddad says, sure, I'll build paradise. This story, I will read to you a big chunk of it because it is stunning, in my opinion, in terms of the thoroughness of modes of exploitation and despoliation. So they say, you need this and that for paradise. He says, what is all this when the whole world from one end to the other is but in my palm? Just do your work, collect, accumulate. All the despots under his command spread across the world and started seizing the wealth of people all around with coercion and oppression. Ships were sent to Ethiopia and all other lands in order to work all the mines of gold and precious stones. He released his men to the lands of Rome and Europe to seize mines of silver and gold. He sent master deep divers to Bahrain and Aden to dig up amber and mother of pearl until not a single pearl was left. No reef was left in the Arabian Sea. And they seized all varieties of minerals from the steppe world in China, as well as all the porcelain produced in China, and perfumes of the musk deer, all aloe wood and logwood and sandalwood and frankincense and cloves and cinnamon and saffron, and incense made of the perfumes of all those. Marble of myriad colors were quarried to make alabaster. Rock crystal glass of all colors was produced in the lands of the Franks and sent thither for window panes. Mirrors were produced in Aleppo and sent thither. All kinds of trees were felled on the 13th day of November, as wisdom dictates, so that the logs do not wither away. Even industrialized agriculture, you will see. Rose trees were planted in Syria, Yemen, and Shiraz, and allowed to grow for 4 or 5 years to then pick their petals and boil them in huge cauldrons so that brooks and streams of rose water would flow through the city. Moreover, all the painters and artists in the whole wide world were recruited and sent thither. And then construction started. Of course, we all know Sheddad will fail miserably. The thoroughness of this recitation of modes of exploitation and despoliation is truly stunning, as I said. There's oppressive revenue collection, confiscation, mining, extracting substances from under the soil to extinction, digging up precious stuff from the bottom of the sea, again to the point of extinction, herbs and plants and deforestation brought to extinction, and deforestation happens. Industrial agriculture happens for fantasy consumption, and the truly global reach of this ecocidal exploitation. And let us remember the derivation of the word ecology from oikos. Namely, ecocide involves the devastation of the oikoi, hanes, households, as pointed out actually by Akgün Hanım on day 2 of the conference, of millions of simple, ordinary people. Ecocide is not just about trees and not just about people and not just about herbs and plants and precious stuff and minerals. This recitation is stunning in terms of the comprehensive nature of bringing this together, including, of course, all the people sent there to work. All of that for the false promise of heaven on earth, like dreams of unlimited progress and economic development in our modern parlance, and for personal gain. Namely, it is not simply a story of punishment for defying God, but it is also an exposition of the kind of devastation that awaits the planet if dreams of heaven on earth are let loose. Now, Sheddad, according to some stories, is the one who gave a crown of kingship to Yanko. And we get to the story of Yanko, who comes certainly after Sheddad in any of the tales, and in some of them there is a direct link between Sheddad and Yanko. To turn to the case of Yanko bin Madyan, we might say he is more cunning than blatantly violent. He does not directly challenge God, but wishes to compete with Suleiman and eventually with Alexander. Remember, the 2 good, virtuous, just world rulers. Yanko wishes to outdo the prophet kings. He wants to assume prophetic power. He has prophethood envy, and thus claims nubuwwet, rather than uluhiyet, divine power. After encountering the remains of the site at Cyzicus, he wonders what the story is behind them. And his wise vizier tells him the story of Suleiman, the kind of thing that I was just telling you about. Upon hearing that, Yanko asks if Suleiman was a mere human being or an angel. And he is told that Suleiman was a human being, but was given prophethood by God. And that is the moment when Janko goes berserk, because he wants to be renowned and prestigious and recognized and known all over the world, just like Süleyman, and says to his viziers that they have to come up with a project. Go sleep and come back in the morning and offer him a project that would make him a prophet king, just like Solomon, just like Süleyman. The next morning, his viziers do come and offer him the possibility of building a huge city, a mega city, a world-renowned city. That is Istanbul, of course, which Süleyman had already discovered, but didn't have the opportunity to build. In the tales, that is how we get to Istanbul, finally found. So Janko builds his Istanbul to be just like that of Süleyman, to achieve that kind of renown and recognition and prestige. But he also starts in several ways to display his evil nature and tyrannical power. And there is a touch added by Evliya that I wish to end with because of its particular relevance for our times. First, a flash forward. Next slide, please. This is Hızır and İlyas. Their day is approaching, my dear friends. Hıdrellez, we may not be able to go out as much as we wish, but still, please, in 2 or 3 weeks, remember Hıdır and İlyas, Hızır ve İlyas, Elijah, whatever your pronunciation of their names, the two characters with flames, halos, and who go through several adventures, of course. Next. Here, the two of them praying in one of the tales with the direction of Mecca. Next. The two of them. Next. Next, move quickly. Okay. Here again, you see the two of them recognizable by the flames, the halos flaming. But right opposite them is sitting Alexander of two horns. And they are engaged in a deep conversation because Alexander wants to, he knows he's destined to conquer the world, but he also wants to conquer time. And he wants to learn from Hızır if one can reach the place where the water of life is supposed to be. That is going to take them, and I'm not going to go through that story, that is going to take them through a series of wonderful adventures. But at the same time, Alexander learns from Hıdır that he can build a channel to connect the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And in fact, he's destined to build it. There was not one at that moment. And on the lower end of the picture, you see his workforce of thieves and ghouls and fairies and vampires, thousands of them actually, who are at this moment building the wall of Alexander to prevent Gog and Magog from coming and devastating civilized lands. After this construction is finished, Alexander and Hızır decide to go to Istanbul. This is happening several hundred years after Janko. This is flash forward, I remind you. So Alexander and Hızır decide to go to Istanbul and work with the same group of laborers to dig the channel that we now know as the Bosphorus, because this was what nature, what providence, what providential design had decreed, had designed. Now, Janko and his brother, who is a historian, but also a king, Janko and his brother Yanvan knew of this legend. They had heard of it directly from King Solomon's, Prophet Solomon's son. But Janko decided that he would pay no heed to the fact that Alexander was destined to come several hundred years after him and build the channel. So instead, Janko decided to do it according to Eremya Çelebi. This is, in written sources, the special touch of Evliya in the larger body of materials concerning Janko. But I suspect he may well have heard it. It may be partly based on the kind of lore that was circulating in the Thracian hinterland. Next. Thracian hinterland of Istanbul. Next. Ah, yes, a picture you have seen a good many times during this conference because of its great significance, of course. The ancient Roman waterways, flowing water supply, supplying water to the city of Constantinople at the very end of that peninsula, Thracian peninsula. More than 250 kilometers, even longer than the water supply system of the city of Rome. This was one of the wonders, of course, of the time, and served for several centuries the city of Constantinople. But there, to this day, are remains of it, and there certainly were more of those remains in the 17th century. And look at the red line also between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, which is the possible path of the Anastasian walls, again with several pieces of ruins, construction pieces, stone construction in bits and pieces lying around, from which modern scholars have been able to project this line, but those ruins were certainly around in the 16th, 17th centuries for people to reflect on, for people to consider possible scenarios, and for people to build tales around. Now, Evliya may have heard some such thing, or this may be simply his invention. In either case, his story brings a very important additional spin to the already charged tales about cities like Kyzikos and Istanbul and Nicomedia, and the environmental hazards that they faced when self-serving, ill-begotten projects of construction happen. In this tale, Evliya's innovation, or what he heard from folks who had no chance to put it into writing, it involves Yanko's dream of digging a channel between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean as an alternative to the Bosphorus before it happened, but against God's decree because people knew it would happen. And I, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, haven't had a chance to walk these same lines as described by Evliya. I know several people have done several walkways, created several hiking paths in this area, also thinking about the projected new channel. But I would like to do that just following Evliya's own description, but because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to do. Just in general, though, let me tell you, he suggests that Yanko's plan was to move from the Çekmece Lake to the Terkos Lake, which is uncanny, really, in terms of the way it just suggests something that I don't need to even belabor this point. I'm sure you understand what I mean. Now, there's a good bit of, there is no romantic interest in Yanko's story, by the way, and I'm very happy about that. Süleyman and Alexander have many romantic interests, and that's wonderful. But not Yanko, not Yanvan, his brother either. The two evil ones cannot have any romantic interest because their heart is overcrowded with envy and raw ambition and thirst for power and sibling rivalry. When Yanvan hears about Yanko's plan to construct a channel, Yanvan says, I have to do one up. I have to do something better. I cannot be beat by my brother. So he says that he would move the Danube all the way to Constantinople so that Constantinople can have water, plenty of water. And I think this is really clearly suggested by the water supply system of Rome, which is, no matter how you look at it, to me, a superhuman achievement of sorts. In any case, the two of them compete, one to build the channel and the other to bring the Danube, the water of the Danube, to the city of Istanbul. He says that he would do it like grabbing a woman by her hair and moving the Danube. You could see a kind of, in Evliya's story at least, you could see a kind of male violence inserted into this story in a very obvious way. I'm unable to tell you the full tale. Evliya never finished the tale, to be perfectly honest with you, but it's clear, in my opinion, to see where he was going with it. Let me just point out that. Next slide, please. Uh-oh. Next. Let me see if... Next. Next. Uh-oh. Okay,
let me
I'll
just check the presentation.
It was a line I stole from Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, I don't know if you know the song, Genghis Khan and his brother Don couldn't keep on keeping on. So I stole it and adopted it. And I said, Yanko and his brother Yanwan couldn't keep on keeping on. That is the end of that tale, but not my conclusion yet. One of the lessons seems to be that Istanbul is a divinely ordained miracle of a place as we have it. And this has as much to do with the soil, the land, the green, the blue, the flora and fauna as it does with urbanites and streets and shops and residences and monuments. There is nothing about the geographic features of the site and their advantages and potentialities that would self-evidently explain the historical experience of communities. The northern forest belt, lately much reduced, or the ayazmas of more than 500 a century ago, only a few known today. The specific flora and fauna of Istanbul, its biodiversity is severely challenged. Even the eternal circulations of the fish through the Bosphorus, currently facing the big unknown of a projected alternative channel, took the forms they took, not to mention their meanings, and I always want to worry about the two things at the same time, forms and meanings. All of these took the forms they took, not to mention their meanings, through interaction with human and other animal communities, and so gradually and incrementally that it would be ludicrous to speak of a 0 point or a foundation except for individual monuments. Steeped in a pre-modern tradition of historical lore and wisdom, with its pre-scientific but reflective and insightful conceptualization of a deep history of the city, Evliya provides ultimately 9 different foundational moments in mythico-chronological order. I believe he would like to point out, in the spirit of many others who had been spinning similar tales for centuries, that the city was found with much difficulty, but was lost again and again in times past. Not just with the disastrous end of Yanko and his evil-worshipping vassals and subjects, but again and again. And all of it due to human folly, ambition, and heedlessness. I say, not again. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Cemal Bey, for this wonderful talk. I think we skipped several slides. Do you want to go over them quickly?
Honestly,
or
that's good enough.
Okay, all right. I will just end with Bob Dylan then, because I found it here.
Yes.
Here you go. Thank you so much. Let me just turn this off.
By the way, there are also stories about Gibraltar, and this is much better known in terms of medieval Muslim geographies. Some attribute the opening of Gibraltar to Alexander. So Alexander opening the Bosphorus Channel is not out of his career path, so to speak.
Thank you so much. I mean, Aslı just wrote a very something that is very true. She said, "Burada güzel bir alkış olacaktı aynı yerde olsak." Yes, I think this conference, what it really lacks is a physical audience that would actually transfer in an audio way how wonderful this was and how truly affected, I think, the entire audience is with this lecture. We can have some questions, some comments, if you like. You can write them on the ask a question bar. There's already one. So yes, Fariba Zainabov asks, any comment on how Muslim geographers conceptualized urban and rural space and iklims, climate?
That's a good one, but a big one. It's a really big one. Especially given my long-windedness, I'm not sure if I should start. But Fariba, I would be happy to write to you on this, or in fact hear from you on this, and we could have an exchange.
Okay.
Surely, I mean, in terms of map making, especially lately, there are very good studies, including our dear friend Chidem, who may be among the audience, and some of her students. And in map making, starting with the work of Ahmet Kara Mustafa, lately there is much more done regarding, for one thing, the kind of synthesizing that took place between the medieval mapping heritage and the new learning that was happening thanks to the cartographic innovations of the 16th and 17th centuries. So that's one of the important things that was happening at the time of Evliya. And Evliya had seen both kinds of maps and both kinds of depictions also beyond maps. He certainly had seen some printed European books with engravings.
Thank you so much. I mean, the talk was really, it really tied a lot of points that have been made during the conference, starting from, as you said, Anna Singh's opening talk about generating new forms of storytelling and telling other forms of stories as well, stories of histories that humans are not necessarily the real heroes or protagonists, but rather multiplicity of beings. So even that, but of course, in terms of geography, in terms of construction projects, infrastructure, contemporary politics, it really is a great conclusion, really, to the conference.
One connection I wanted to make is to the paper by Deniz Öztürk on excavation. And in some tales, definitely in Eremya Çelebi, when the Bosphorus Channel is dug up, Hızır is in charge of the soil. I think you need a character like Hızır to be able to deal with the hafriyat of that scale. And I think it really is a matter of miraculous intervention for you to be able to do something that is otherwise so invasive. People were negotiating all of these different ideas, I think, and tensions and issues and dilemmas within a different, of course, paradigm. But one needs to be able to reach out and listen to their voices.
I think Deniz's talk that you mentioned, Deniz Öztürk's, it really is, it by itself connects almost all the papers that were presented in the conference, because it has such a central, I mean, it presents on such a central issue. Whatever you do, there is some excavation debris, and there is a economy of excavation. I mean, I'm just reminded of Gizem Kıygız paper, for example, on the Tepebaşı and Taksim cemeteries, and how Tepebaşı cemetery was transformed in part thanks to the excavation debris of another infrastructure project, that is the tunnel, because that's where the debris was dropped out. So it really connects, the excavation really connects a lot of different points. And I should also mention the project that you announced. I didn't know about this. The Cem Dinlenmiş is really one of the best news that I have personally received for a long time, and I couldn't hide my excitement and wrote with by the institutional account on the chat panel, just saying this is the best news I received for a while, and then I had to delete it because this is an institutional account after all. So I am going to read several of the questions that came on the chat, on the Ask a Question panel. Another panelist, Gabriel Doyle, says, "Thank you so much for this inspirational talk. Could Cemal Hoca elaborate on his vision of the relationship between storytelling and the contemporary discipline of history, especially as he seems to develop projects outside of academic circles like documentaries and graphic novels?" Wonderful question that I would be very happy if you can respond.
It's a question I've been reflecting on and trying to also dirty my hands with for some time in different ways. It's a great question. Of course, historians have been asking this for a long, long time. This will be a very simple and maybe superficial answer, and I apologize, but one obvious thing to point out is that narrative history was sidelined, neglected, and marginalized for a long, long time. And even before that, as that was happening in academic history writing, even before that, stories or engagement with tales and legends and myths, even if one doesn't tell the stories oneself, but even engaging with such a body of materials seriously, as I said, trying to find out what kind of learning that represented. That too was sidelined and marginalized and considered unnecessary interest in unnecessary labor spent on old-fashioned superficial tales. So there's a long history of this kind of sidelining, marginalizing, neglecting of narrative history for one, but also of stories in general. And thankfully, I think many colleagues realize that it was impoverishing for history writing. And we also, I mean, we are also learning so much from these new trends in environmental history and the history of non-human animals, in which they encourage us to think about other ways of learning, other ways of processing information, other ways of developing conscious, knowledgeable, mindful relationship to our environment, physical and otherwise. And from that new epistemological opening, I believe that is something I alluded to in the beginning of my lecture. From that epistemological opening, some of us draw the inspiration that we can also learn from the ways of learning embedded in storytelling, from the ways of, though obviously in certain fields, anthropology, folklore studies, psychology, learning from narratives and narrativizing is of deeper foundation and probably of more systematic foundation. But history writing has gone back and forth on this, and I'm glad it's coming back.
So building upon on this, actually, you said that we are as a field learning from environmental history. Can you speak more specifically about Ottoman environmental history? Like, how do you see this perhaps a bit delayed emergence of the field, and how it specifically contributes to the Ottoman studies?
Of course, it's a welcome development. That's something very easy to agree on. And it's happening, delayed or not. Sometimes there are advantages in looking through and looking at the kinds of critique that take place when a new trend first emerges in its raw form. I don't necessarily think of this as a disadvantage in the long run. People are learning quickly and catching up with colleagues in other fields of not just environmental history, of course, environmental studies. One needs to probably think about, as this conference did. Sometimes in describing the conference to friends, I said environmental history, and then I immediately stopped myself and said, no, it was about placing Istanbul in the much larger framework of environmental studies. In terms of what's happening, I think good things are happening with regard to climate studies, etc., in the field of Ottoman studies. One desideratum from my point of view is something that came up during our panel yesterday, because I think Alex does it so well, namely, while thinking about environmental matters, which easily lend themselves sometimes to non-social, non-human kinds of data collecting. What was the temperature like? How many fish were there? Although I'm afraid nobody's really asked. One of my big desiderata is and maybe there are some amongst our audience who have already started or who can work with me or whatever. So long as somebody does it, a population study of Istanbul with at least some of the very obvious, at first, non-human animals.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to the question about environmental history, I think some of that kind of quantified, numerical, statistical study, extremely useful, no doubt. Some of it can be short-sighted when it comes to considering how it all works with human and other agents in that environment, which is experiencing the climate change, which is experiencing the winds, which is experiencing the currents, so on and so forth. Namely, one really needs to focus a lot, as in any field of history, on the webs of meaning spun in the minds of the people we study. I cannot emphasize that too much. To me, this is key to studying anything. Monetary matters, climate matters, when they lend themselves to quantifiable statistical data collection, that is wonderful. I engage in some of that myself. I like it. But I would never want to consider it as a kind of wind blowing over the minds, over the heads, and over the bodies of beings. Because it's not that simple. In a recent essay I wrote for a book that Chidem and Shirin have kindly invited me to contribute, I also want to point out that the august diarchy of Istanbul. I mean, if you look at who commands Istanbul over the millennia, it's Poyraz and Lodos, no doubt. This is the august diarchy.
Lodos definitely commands on me, that's for sure, Cemal Bey.
So, and they're whimsical, as far as we are concerned, because I don't understand. But even they are not so dictatorially powerful that we somehow cannot work with them, get beaten by them maybe, but find ways of ways of mitigating the impact, so on and so forth.
Thank you. Sibel asks, myths and ancient texts are full of warnings against challenging divine order, such as Shaddad, Jamshid. Early modern European texts reversed this by arguing the civilizing force of exploiting resources, Agrippa sanctioning mining as opposed to Pliny's warning against plucking the entrails of the Mother Earth. Is there a counterpart in the Ottoman Islamic world that prepares the ground for and sanctions this kind of modernist conquest of nature? Prepares the ground and sanctions.
Excellent question. Just my kind of question. Not that I know a good answer to it, but really wonderful question. Yes. Yes, I think, but the chronology could be, after a while, certainly it's obvious when adopting new techniques, including eventually industrial techniques, newly industrial techniques. The Ottoman world is in a constant give and take compared to the kind of picture that, for instance, Bernard Lewis had once drawn. What was it? The Muslim discovery of Europe, where he even uses the image of an iron curtain. This was, of course, he was writing it at the time of the Cold War, and a Cold Warrior himself. So he mentions the image of a iron curtain dividing the Islamic world, in that case, mostly the Ottoman world from Europe. We have been discovering, I do seminars, but many other colleagues have been discovering again and again that there was a tremendous amount of give and take of techniques and ideas, not immediately maybe, not as directly as happened between Holland and France or so, but nonetheless, and looking at exchanges between, especially looking at conversations between European scientists or physicians, many physicians were working in Istanbul, of course, or characters like Baron de Thot invited to offer something of the new military technologies and techniques. Some of them invited, some of them just adventurers, some of them enslaved, engaged in conversations with their Ottoman colleagues, with the, let's call them all virtuosi, people of multiple interests in different kinds of learning and sharing knowledge from coming from different paradigms maybe, but sharing this kind of knowledge. I think of the Chelebis mostly in this framework. Looking at their exchanges, Marsili and Hezarfen Hussein is a good example, lately studied by colleagues in a more direct manner, intense manner, should tell us much more about also views exchanged regarding attitudes to what we call nature, what we call resources out there in nature. So this is unfortunately not a substantive answer to the question, but I hope it gives an idea as to what kinds of pathways there are to reaching it, and something that is also already happening. Yeah. Should stop myself thinking of examples.
Okay, I think something that you would enjoy answering, Çiğdem Öztürk asks, can you tell us your favorite neighborhood in Istanbul and why? And I think it's a good note to finish the conference. So
that's such a tough one, though, right? I mean, how do you pick? How do you pick? This thing about neighborhoods is peculiarly Istanbulite. I mean, every city has neighborhoods and characteristics of neighborhoods, but I remember Tanpınar's Beşşehir Five Cities, the section, the big long essay on Istanbul, where he does talk about how every neighborhood is remembered, considered, talked about, imagined, dreamt about by certain produce, by certain looks, by certain vistas that people recognize from other neighborhoods, and this shared culture of neighborhood assessments, neighborhood appreciation, if you will, is all over our songs and poetry, our, in this case, meaning the denizens of Istanbul and people who study Istanbul. Having skirted the question, my goodness, I have different answers at different moments. Where I grew up, I love the hills of Eyüp. I grew up in Rami. The kind of deep vista to the Golden Horn, all the way to the Topkapı Palace, it afforded to a relatively modest neighborhood, was just amazing. It was a blessing. But and Eyüp itself, as part of that community, on a good, clear day, really clear day, from the terrace on the third floor of the building where we lived, we could see the snowy peaks of Mount Olympus, Uludağ. I mean, even now, sometimes I hear it's visible, especially after the pandemic, for unfortunate reasons, because there's less industrial activity. But when I first read such tales in Eremya Çelebi, sometimes people say, this is just Evliya, typical exaggeration. Well, some of it is exaggeration, yes, but some of it is also a matter of climate change, whereby we could see from Eyüp, from the hills, from up top, we could see the snowy peaks of Mount Olympus, and that was exhilarating. My mother is from a village of Triria, from a village of Bursa, so when we could see that, it was for her like homecoming, a special day to enjoy. But I love where I live now, İstinye, between İstinye and Emirgan and Yeniköy. Especially during the pandemic, I have such a blessed outdoorsy set of possibilities. I'm happy, and soon the Erguvan are coming out. But I also spent all my teenage years in Fatih, real Fatih in the narrow sense. Nowadays it's applied to the whole old Istanbul, the real Istanbul, Nefsi Istanbul. I don't accept that. But across the street from the Fatih Mosque, and there too, for maybe there were the seeds of interest, all kinds of interest in Ottoman architecture and this and that, because every street corner in the Fatih neighborhoods could give you a tremendous vista of a piece of remarkable architecture, as you all know, Byzantine, Ottoman. So I didn't pick. I'm unable to pick. I apologize.
But I think that's what we were expecting from you, as I think Çiğdem was also when she asked the question. Speaking of İstinye and how relatively a good experience it was during the pandemic living there, I'm reminded of another panelist in the conference, Yaşar Adanalı's suggestion, not made in the conference, but I know that he has this idea of reconsidering the Bosphorus as a sort of a central park. Really, that should be the so. And of course, it goes back to today's talks on public parks and how they are being used as tools of urbanization. Perhaps really what Istanbul needs is considering the shores of Bosphorus as this central park, as our public ground, as really our space that we share as the inhabitants of the city, humans and non-humans.
Terrific idea. And maybe also the Golden Horn, both of them used to be so much more used, obviously, for transportation and for pleasure. Especially if you take away the mass tourism use of the Bosphorus nowadays.
Yeah.
I mean, one may look out and one may see many boats on a pre-pandemic or post-pandemic, hopefully, summer day, but it's not the same thing as Istanbulites using the city waters. And there's much, much more to be done. I thought, listening to your question, of the Shamsipasha Mosque, which is, of course, under threat right now for obvious reasons. And some people thought that, I read that the gate opening to the seaside must have implied a road. Hence, building a road there would make perfect sense. You know what I mean? That by building a gate on the seaside, Sinan, the architect, and later users of the building must have had a road in front of the mosque on the seaside in mind for the gate to be functional. That is so blind to the use of the water in the city, which would go all the way into gates, all the way into houses even, right? We may not be able to recreate it. Let's not get nostalgic. I can understand all this, but let us understand what used to be the case. And that is something that I would add to Yaşar Adanalı's suggestion, using the water much more rather than building cement around it to turn it into another kind of park.
Yeah, exactly. There are still a lot of very good questions, but I think we should stop somewhere. But this is true for this session, but also for the other sessions as well. We will circulate all the chats and all the questions to the panelists and to the speakers.
Please.
So, and of course, Discord is there as well. So that's still, there is still venues to continue the discussion. Cemal Bey, if you want to answer any of the questions that if you can see at the Ask a Question tab, we can address one or two. Otherwise, I can transit into the closing of the conference with final thanks part of our session.
I think maybe we should close. I can see that I could get engaged, but I would be happy to receive them and then be in touch. I can also see wonderful references such as to Ethem Eldem's article on Iskender, Alexander, and Kaydafe, which does relate to the body of tales that I was speaking about. Yes.
Okay, so we will definitely do that. And with this, I think it's time for us to close this conference. We are all tired. I'm sure the audience and the presenters, panelists, they're all tired as well. But I'm also a bit sad because this has been such a wonderful 4 days. We are thankful to all the contributors, paper presenters, Bir Buçuk creators, the latter of which have accepted our invitation to contribute in an unconventional way. And I think rose brilliantly to the occasion to produce really striking and relevant work. Thanks to all the audience. We had around 1,700 people registered to the conference in total, and all sessions had at least 150 listeners. And they contributed immensely to the discussion through their comments, questions, suggestions here and in Discord. That really gave this event the feeling of a conference organized in a physical setting where we had the ability to chat during coffee breaks, suggest different readings, etc. I hope that technical issues were kept at a manageable minimum. We had some, but I don't think they really destroyed the feeling, the feel of the conference. And I'm really proud and happy this, I think, made the best of the word, best use of the word conference. It's really compared, or as Cemal Bey said in reference to Ursula Le Guin, it's really put us in sync and engaged us with other ways of learning. I think it was a result of a lot of collaborations with institutions and collectives, organizations, but also new collaborations and networks, I think, are emerging from this event. We have the responsibility of building upon them now. not only through conventional academic means, which we are committed to do. So there will be some publications that will be produced out of this, but also through other means, public scholarship means, artistic means. I think we saw that they're all very productive and very exciting. We will keep the Discord open, I think, for some while, so that discussion can continue there, definitely. And now I would like to name the unnamed heroes of this organization, whose efforts really made this event possible. The organizing committee consisted of Yasemin Ülgen, who I think really made this, whose effort really made this conference something else, something bigger, something that really connected all these different people and initiatives, artistic and activist sides of it, through her work at Bir Buçuk, of course, together with her colleagues. So that was really very important, I think, for the conference. Özlem Altınkaya, whose dissertation Cemal Bey has referred to in the talk, with whom I co-organized a panel at the European Society of Environmental History that served as a kernel for this conference. So her presence was also very important. My colleagues at Istanbul Research Institute, Gürü Tanman and Emir Alışık, Onur İnal at University of Vienna, whose labor was very important as well for connecting us to European and American societies of environmental history. Etemcan Turhan, who also represented Occupy Climate Change, Duygu Kaşdoğan, who represented Istanbul Lab, and Menekşe Kızıldere, who represented Heinrich Böll Stiftung in the organizing committee. You saw Gül İçel and Ryan Mitchell during the panels, who hosted many of the events at Crowdcast. Our project team also included Defne Özözer, who was responsible for social media, and Osman Kocabal, he coordinated the Discord server. Our communication team, Büşra Mutlu, Irmak Böber, Zeynep Kantemir, they all worked during the weekends and very hard to make this conference draw this much attention. So their work is very valuable. And our graphic designer, Volkan Şenozan, designed a beautiful booklet that you'll all see. I think it's now printed and will be sent to you. Our collaboration with Terafilm was thanks to Gizem Bayıksel. Translations for the booklet was made by Ercan Akyol, and proofreading was provided by Jacob Chizo. And all our colleagues at Pera Museum and Istanbul Research Institute, and of course all the involved organizations, all of their efforts are very much appreciated. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Cemal Bey. This has been really it was really a big pleasure for us to have you as the closing remarks speaker. Thank you so much.